Hi, everyone. Welcome to Across the Divide. Because of the upcoming US elections, many people who care about peace and justice in Palestine and Israel have been wrestling with the question, who shall they vote for in the upcoming presidential American elections? Should they vote for Trump, who's known to be very pro-Israel and very dismissive of the Palestinians? Should they vote for Joe Biden, who has been the main sponsor through his government of the war in Gaza? He's been nicknamed as Genocide Joe and has been sending an endless stream of weapons to Israel that has led to the destruction of so many of the lives and the future in Gaza? Or should we vote for a third party, none of these two main parties in the US, or should we not vote at all? Now, Joe Biden stepped aside and Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee for president. So now the question becomes, should we vote for Kamala Harris, or should we vote for Trump, or should we vote for a third party, or no one at all? Now, to help us unpack this question, and I think provide us a very thoughtful response to kind of the tension that exists there, is Tyler Huckabee. I came across Tyler from an article that he published at Religious News Service titled, "Why I'm a Christian for Kamala, but not a Christian for Kamala," as in why he is a Christian who is voting for Kamala, but he's not a Christian for Kamala, as in he's not someone who considers himself a supporter of Kamala Harris. A very thoughtful article that he has published. It is in the show notes. Check that out. Maybe read it before you continue listening to this conversation, because kind of helps you to ground and understand his perspective before we talk about it. And then we talk about that article. And also for our Patreon supporters, we also discuss some of his writings on Christianity Today. You might know of the magazine Christianity Today that has taken a very problematic position towards what's happening in Gaza. By the way, Tyler Huckabee is a writer living in Nashville, Tennessee. He's a prolific writer and publishes his articles on his Substack. The link for his Substack is also in the show notes. He writes on politics, mostly American politics, on Palestine and Israel, which is refreshing, has been very refreshing for me. But also he writes on Katy Perry and the X-Men and Marvel Comics. So he's a very fascinating and very insightful person and author. So check him out. So here is my conversation with Tyler Huckabee. Hey, Tyler, it's so good to have you on the podcast on Across the Divide. Welcome.
Thank you, Daniel. It's very good to be here too. I'm excited.
I've been wanting to talk to you since I heard your name recently while listening to the Holy Post, a Christian podcast, and they were having a discussion about different Christian attitudes towards the elections. Those who are pro-Kamala, those who are pro-life, and because of pro-life, they couldn't be pro-Kamala. And even though they dislike Trump, but they were like, pro-life abortion is the main issue for us. And then you came and I heard what they said about you, and you had this passive or like a comment in passing about, I would like, if I'm going to vote for Kamala, if I'm going to support Kamala, I would like her to the effect of, stop sending money to Netanyahu to bomb people in Gaza. And I'm like, whoa, I did not expect a comment about Gaza when Christians are discussing American, like the elections, because this is not a topic that Christians or Christian authors will bring up whenever they think about the elections. At least for me, like that was never something I've heard before. So I checked you out and I looked up your stuff and that article you wrote, which we're going to discuss. And I'm just super impressed by the work you're doing, and I just really wanted to talk with you. So yeah, thanks for coming.
Well, no, that means a lot to me. I appreciate that, and I know that is not I listened to that Holy Post episode. Phil Vischer, who is the host of that. Obviously, he texted me a few days before that conversation, just to I think ask some clarifying questions about the article that you referenced there, and he both in that text conversation I had with him and then on the episode itself, kind of glanced over the bit about Gaza because it was almost, in his defense, it was not a huge focus of that article itself that I wrote, but it is something that is very important to me and is a very, I think, a hugely important, one of the most important issues in the presidential election that we're coming up on. So I'm glad to be able to talk to you about it a little more in depth here.
Right. I would assume people, if they want to discuss that article with you, they're not going to ask you to talk about the Gaza bit. So that's why we're here. So before we talk about this, and I think it's an important conversation for a lot of folks, especially Christians, who have been very disturbed by the war and now are rethinking their voting and the choice they have to make. And I think for a lot of them, especially our audience, I think Gaza is one of those things, the main things. And maybe for some of them, even it's become the single issue vote for them. They couldn't vote for Biden because genocide Biden, or genocide Joe rather.
Genocide
so then
Joe,
there's this, well, Trump and Kamala. So what do we do? But before we talk about this, I'm super curious to know about you and your background. And you are live in Tennessee, from what I could tell. So how did a Tennessee white man got so interested in the Palestine issue?
Well, it was a journey for sure. I live in Nashville with my wife here, but I'm a Midwestern guy originally. I was born and raised in Nebraska, which is the wide open plains, not too far from where Coach Tim Walz was coaching his football team. That was right up the street from him. I think I can't remember for sure, but I think I may have played his football team when I was a student there when he was a coach. The timeline checks out. But I was raised in, I think like a lot of evangelical kids were fundamentalist adjacent evangelical kids with kind of I would say like loosely Zionist theology. We didn't talk about it a whole lot. It wasn't a major part of like my church. It was just sort of like in the air that, we like for the most part just are behind Israel no matter what they do because the Abrahamic covenant and yada yada. But it was just in the air. I don't remember that ever being taught to me explicitly. It was just something that was sort of implied. And so I accepted that pretty unthinkingly through most of my middle school years and then even into high school a little bit. And it wasn't until college I went to Moody Bible Institute, which is quite conservative, very conservative college in Chicago, and certainly not exactly not a bastion of Palestinian rights there or anything like that. Certainly not. But you do, as college will do, no matter how hard people in college might try to keep you from that, you start getting exposed to different ideas and different ways of thinking. And in my case there, Palestinian Christians who came to the U.S. and some of whom went to Moody with me. And that's just something I think like a lot of Christians, you feel stupid the first time you encounter it, but it doesn't really occur to you that the Gaza Strip is made up of a lot of different kinds of people, and that it's not Hamas, it's not this one like kind of like general big bad guy. Like I think a lot of people originally kind of think of it as like orcs until they think about it, but then you start meeting people and it gives you a broader worldview, and then you have to humble yourself and ideally repent of a lot of the ideas that you had assumed or just had not even just sort of taken in, and start then ideally educating yourself, which is what I did. And I had the opportunity to do that, especially after I graduated and got a job at Relevant Magazine, which is where I worked for quite a while. We were able to work with a number of people who are in Israel who work in Gaza. So some people who work for peace in Gaza. And I think some people do that more effectively than others. And some people, I would say I agree with ideologically more than others, but it is at least a good way, or it was an education for me in editing a lot of these articles, a lot of these first person accounts, people on the ground, journalists, activists, Christians, Jewish people, Muslims, who were working together for something much more nuanced and much more with more liberation in mind than just keeping the status quo intact. And the status quo was what I'd been raised believing was appropriate. And the more I learned about that region, what was happening there, and the more I edited these pieces and the more I started seeing these articles and educating myself, the more I realized that status quo is simply unacceptable for people of moral conscience.
So this came out of just meeting and talking about or listening to Christians who were doing work in Gaza and Israel, right? In Palestine,
That
Israel.
was the
Not through
genesis.
personal
Yeah.
encounters. Yeah, go ahead.
That was where it started. Yeah, I would say that was not sort of maybe the first crack in a lot of my biases and just what the way I'd been raised of thinking. Yeah, that was a
Okay.
very important part of what started to get me more interested and then eventually passionate about the Palestinian people and their liberation.
Okay, well, what happened then? Like, you can learn about what's happening. Why would you become passionate about Palestinian liberation? That's like a strong statement.
Yeah, I think in some ways, I I think at first there was sort of I felt the need to just sort of atone for it. The more I saw how much white Christians like myself had been involved in furthering the oppression of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, had just sort of by our own either complicit being complicit in maintaining, in right now, like in the case, in our current case, Netanyahu and his administration, or sometimes more than just being complicit, full throated encouragement and being cheerleaders for what was happening in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I think that for those of us who have been a part of that, for people like me, whose communities and whose religious groups and whose churches and whose families and activist networks have been a huge part of that, it is probably more important for us to speak up and to be vocal and to try to push the people who we're close to rethink their attitudes about these things, and not just their attitudes, but their voting habits and who they're giving their money to and who they're supporting and sending over there. So in some ways, I guess I feel like it's maybe part of the passion that I have for this, it comes from a place of responsibility, and knowing that, I think that not all the time for sure, but I think that sometimes I'm, because of just the color of my skin and the networks that I have, I'm able to talk to some people, some of those people might be inclined to listen to me in a way they're not going to listen to other people. And
Right.
so I want to be responsible with that as well, and use that leverage and be not prideful. I want to be humble about how I use that, but I want to be responsible with it as well.
Yeah, that's commendable, Ty. You would think that your professors at Moody would push you towards a different direction.
Well, they did. It was this did not this to be clear, this did not happen with their
this happened afterward, but
yeah, this was accidental.
Yeah, exactly. But at least you still were able to develop your own kind of critical, like self-inspection and critical analysis of the contribution of Christianity, even though you kind of came out of, maybe, I don't know your background before then, but presumably if you go to Moody, then you would come from a certain kind of evangelical background.
Fairly, very, very evangelical, fairly conservative, politically, theologically. So in ways that are some of which I still feel are valuable, but many of which I've had to move away from.
So do you think Palestine was one of these issues of deconstruction? I don't know if that's a term that you would use, but if you went to Moody and now this is where you stand, I feel you must have gone through this kind of unsettling journey of shedding away a lot of the baggage that you held before.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't really have the word deconstruction didn't start to get thrown around until quite a ways after I feel like I'd sort of gone through that process. I don't know that I had a word for it when it was happening to me.
Sure.
But after I did and started seeing some of these social media communities on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, and started talking about deconstruction, I was like, oh yeah, I know what that is.
Yeah, that works.
that sort
sure,
of,
I'll claim
tracks.
it.
Yeah. And it's very as I've done some writing about that as well, and some of it is reported, and as I've found when I talk to a lot of Christians who've been through that, it can be a very lonely process. And if you deconstruct from a certain kind of socio-political, religious conservatism into something different, you can end up losing a lot of friends, which I definitely, it kind of cracks me up when you see some people, some like kind of conservative influencers say people just deconstruct so they can get more, I don't know, power or money or like be more popular with their friends. That is not what happened to me. At least I can't speak to everybody else, but I lost way more friends and financial opportunities and professional status than I gained by going through that. But I also feel, I can sleep better in some ways than I could beforehand. And I feel a much more cohesion in terms of my relationship with God and with the world around me and with issues that are important to me, like this one we're talking about today.
Okay. Have you been to Palestine ever?
No, I haven't. I've
Palestine.
not
Okay.
been. That was actually maybe for the best. That was offered a couple of times. I've had the opportunity first in college where they would, send Christians on kind of a tour of the Holy Land and
Yeah.
you walk where Jesus walked, one of those whole things. Right. And I chose instead to go to England. I don't know why, but I did.
The other Holy Land.
The other Holy Land. And then more recently, when I was at Relevant, we did send a team over to do some work during one of the, I can't remember which year this actually was, but one of the uprisings where tensions were getting high again. And somebody had to stay behind and keep the wheels on the ship while everybody else went over there, and I drew the short end of the stick there. So I hung back while the rest of the team did that. So those are my two opportunities that my two almost to Israel, but neither of them happened. I have not been over there.
Okay, well, it's kind of interesting to me because from my experience with talking with people who had to make that theological faith shift when it comes to Palestine, it was mostly their visits that really kind of transformed how they thought about it. Sure. So it's interesting that you have such a...
If I can ask you a question, what do you think it is about being there that is the key to that conversion experience?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't answer from my personal perspective because that's not my story, because I grew up there. But I think it's just seeing violence and discrimination embodied, and it hits you in the face in a very strong way. Like you see the wall and you see the segregation and you're so close to it, and you're passing by and you see the checkpoints and you see the machine guns, and you pass by a refugee camp and you see the devastation. There is a very clear polarity between the Palestinian life and Palestinian experience and the Jewish-Israeli one. And I think people who are sensitive and who are critical, they would see that very clearly. The first trip that you would have gone on would have been one of those what I call brainwashing trips, where you would be very catered to keep you kind of sheltered and focus on piety and going to churches as a way to whitewash what's happening. So that's a completely different experience. And that's a trip to Israel. Like, even though you would go to Bethlehem, to the West Bank, you don't really go to Palestine. Even though you are in Palestine, you don't go to Palestine, you go to Israel. It's like a completely different experience. But those who actually intentionally go to Bethlehem, go to Hebron, go to Nablus, go to see the refugee camps, it's very obvious to them. And I think from conversations with people, meeting Palestinian Christians has always been impactful for them, to hear someone that they share the faith with tell them a different narrative that they're not really used to, because mostly people come from a very binary way of thinking about Muslims and Arabs. So to see someone who speaks your language as a Christian, but also speaks a language of the so-called enemy, Muslims or Arabs, it's an unsettling experience. And usually it's the Palestinian Christian encounter is the most impactful. At least that's what I've been told.
Well, I have as well, and I've edited or even commissioned some of these pieces where people have written about their experience, and it feels, again, it's kind of humbling that sometimes it takes something this obvious to spark the transformation. But that's how it, I understand that person-to-person contact like that just puts a face and a body, and sometimes a great deal of trauma and loss to what had up to that point been a very simple black and white issue in your mind. And it is interesting to me now, especially since what happened last October, to bring these issues up, to bring up that it is not, that these actions are affecting your fellow Christians. Like, these are, I know maybe in your mind, this is just Muslims and Arabs and those are the bad guys and whatever. But there are the Christians over there who are suffering as well. And I don't think anybody has a good response. They just kind of blink at you like an animal, and like they can't figure, like don't know how to process that. I hope that, hearing those stories and bringing those stories up inspires some change in some people, especially some people who have some influence and some power to change things over there. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that yet, but I know that the call for change is definitely growing and is probably louder now than I've ever seen it be in my lifetime. And whether or not that breaks through to the presidential administrations, to Netanyahu to be looking to actually make a difference remains to be seen. But I'm hoping and praying that that's the case.
Yeah, I would love to talk with you. That's an interesting point because it kind of touches on two issues, which I want to talk with you. One is Christianity Today and the position that people there have taken, especially Russell Moore, especially Mike Cosper, and by extension, David French. All of them you address in your articles in your Substack. We'll make sure to have those in the show notes for the audience. But also there's, but then there is a shift away from that discourse into Christians paying attention to Palestine and to the tragedy in Gaza and the Palestinian story in general. And then there's the other issue that you're seeing change happening as well, which is in the political sphere, as you've been alluding to. And we're seeing a growing shift among Americans, Jewish, Christian, and Christians as well, who are shifting to the far left or the progressive left because of Gaza. I want to talk about Christianity Today, but I think I want to focus on the elections for now, but for our Patreon supporters, we can have that conversation about Christianity Today, because I think it's an important conversation to have about the position of CT. But let's focus now on the elections, since you want to talk about it. So on August 14, you published this article, Why I'm a Christian for Kamala, but not a Christian for Kamala. So you are a Christian who would vote for Kamala, but you're not a Christian for Kamala kind of in a group. Or this makes sense without the quotation marks. So you're a Christian who would vote for Kamala, but you don't define yourself as a Christian for Kamala. And this came, you published this article a few days after a group that came out, they call themselves Christians for Kamala. And I think they announced themselves just a few days after, I think Biden or Kamala kind of was announced as the nominee, the Democratic nominee. And it had influential people that you admittedly also say that these people who have influenced you, like Dante Stewart, like Deanna Butler, and other folks that have been kind of instrumental in how you also view your faith. I think also Lisa Sharon Harper is also in that group.
I believe you're right, yeah.
And we had her on the podcast. She spoke at Christ at the Checkpoint last May, and we had her on the podcast as well. So these are kind of incredible moderate evangelicals, I think, who tend to be like yourself, like you say, that their politics do not conveniently map into either political party. But then they saw, and we can talk about their arguments, but basically they were compelled to support, to gather themselves as Christians for Kamala, and to vote for Kamala as to make a clear move away from Trump. I don't know. Is that kind of fair? Is that how you understand?
I think so. Yeah. I think so. That's my. It gets a little complicated because there are two groups. There's evangelicals for Harris, and there's Christians for Kamala, who are distinct groups with, I think, even some overlap in the people who are part of them. But they are.
I think Lisa Sharon Harper is with evangelicals. You're right.
Okay. I think you're right. But I don't know how much they even care about the distinction. And as far as I can tell, they basically share the same aims.
Right. So what makes you a Christian for Kamala, but not a Christian for Kamala?
Well, yeah, and I'll answer your question. The straightforward answer to your question is I'm pretty skeptical of joining any, and I lay this out in the article a bit. I don't like groups that are just coming behind a single politician or a single political party. I think that is a dangerous place for us to get into in a democracy, because in a democracy, our power comes from our influence, from our ability to be persuasive, to be critical of our elected leaders, and honestly to encourage them, to push them, sometimes to bully them into doing what we, the people, want them to do. And I think when you give your full throated, uncritical, unnuanced support to any one candidate, you lose a lot of that power because you're kind of saying, I'm behind you no matter what. You've got my vote. Now, that may be the case for a lot of people listening to this who would, they don't want to vote for Donald Trump, so they're going to vote for Harris because they don't want Trump to be another president. I'm very sympathetic to that. But what I'm encouraging people to do is be very cautious about aligning themselves behind a candidate, especially when I think it is way more effective to align yourself behind a cause that you care about, whether that's a situation in Gaza or something like abortion, which I know is a very important issue to many Christians, or even something, climate change, what's happening in Ukraine, something like that. Find an issue you care about, get behind that, raise some awareness, raise some money, and then use that group to influence politicians who are going to be flexible and have a listening ear for your issues. Now, I think Harris is going to be a much better listener on these issues than Donald Trump would be, but I would want to make sure I'm putting myself in a good position to be heard. And I'm not convinced that just saying I'm a Christian for Kamala no matter what is the best way to be heard.
Yeah, so you say this in the article, but the reason I hesitate to call myself a Christian for Harris is that when we pledge allegiance to one political candidate, we surrender a lot of the power we have in a democracy. This is more than just semantics. Our political influence comes not just from who we decide to vote for, but how we use our voices in the intervening years between elections. And here's the kicker. A Christians for Undocumented Immigrants group has a lot more leverage to influence politicians and hold them accountable than a Christians for a politician group does. Which is such a remarkable move. You're shifting the focus from Kamala, who could possibly be the next president, into an undocumented immigrant. And for me, this is like a power move, or like a gospel, a Christ move, where you move from those, like you go from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, right? Like you go from the center of power into that peasant village, right? And I think and for me is like, whoa, because this is I think for me, it shows, I don't want to flatter you here, but it shows that heart of Christ there, that you're centering your attitude towards the least privileged and the least powerful people. And in this case, you use the example of, undocumented immigrants, which is, I mean, if Christians would think in those terms, what a shift, what a different way of how we would conceive of our politics.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
But your point, Tyler, is so necessary because you're grounding your political position on ethical standards, on values, and not on a politician who holds power and on a politician who doesn't really care about you. And you become, and creates that kind of tribalism, right? I'm going to support Kamala, I'm going to support Trump no matter what. But you're saying, no, I want to support the most powerless people in the world. In this case, refugees. In this case, Gaza. In this case, undocumented immigrants. And just such a beautiful way to kind of flip the political system on its head. I don't know if you intended to do that, Tyler,
no,
but that's
I
just
appreciate
how I
that.
read
That's
it.
very kind. That's very kind of you. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that, and I do think I don't know if this might be a uniquely American thing. I kind of don't think it is. I think this is a little bit universal, but it's certainly true in America that we start treating our politicians like pop stars, basically. And Kamala Harris is if she wins the election, will be a very powerful person who has a lot of influence. I think that we should try to influence her, but there's no reason for you to feel like wearing her name on your T-shirt. Like, what do you do? like you do that with Taylor Swift. That's fine. I don't care about that. That is what it is, and that doesn't bother me at all. But pop stars are for being fans of. Politicians are for pressuring and for trying to make your voice heard to them, and basically getting them to carry out the will of the people, which is allegedly what we do. And now, obviously, that doesn't always work that way. But some of that is because we've gotten very bad at asking our politicians, our elected officials, to do the things we want them to do. And we kind of go to the ballot box every 4 years and consider our job in, our role in politics done there. And I think we deserve better. I think that we can do better. And I think that part of us doing better will come from not being fans of politicians, but being what we're supposed to be, which is using them as our megaphone to enact democracy.
Right, and this is such a good point, and it makes me think about the uncommitted movement.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
Americans, Muslims, Arabs, Christians, and others are saying we cannot vote for Joe.
Of course.
This is genocide, Joe. He doesn't earn our vote. And those in the Democratic Party and others, and you see it on social media, we're basically guilting them for making that moral decision, or at least expressing their frustration with the system. And they were like, oh, if you're going to do that, then you're going to vote for Trump, or like you are basically voting Trump. And so using scare tactics to guilt them. And the position that I heard from them is like, he doesn't earn my vote. Like, he has to earn it. He doesn't automatically get my vote just because he's not Trump. Actually, he has to earn it, and he hasn't earned my vote. But that's the thing, is like, if you see the president as a civil servant and not as someone that we need to bow down to, I think it makes all the difference. And I think there's such a beautiful principled position of that uncommitted movement. They're saying Joe is responsible for the genocide in Gaza. We cannot, in good conscience, no matter how much we don't dislike Trump, we can never feel good about giving him our vote. And in the same way, I think that's kind of the same sentiment you're expressing here. Like, I'm not going to just automatically be pro Kamala just because she's not Trump, right?
Right. That's exactly what I'm saying, and I think that I wrote that piece almost a month ago now, coming up on a month ago. Since then, I would be remiss if I did not say I have not been impressed with what the Harris campaign has said about what she planned. I wrote that piece from a spirit of optimism, and I have been very disappointed with I think people were excited about the potential for a shift in U.S. policy towards the Palestinian people and towards what I call in the piece, I think, blank checks that we're sending over to Netanyahu and to the IDF. She has not signaled any intention to change on that. I'm hopeful that if enough people speak up, then she could shift position on that. I do believe that, and I hope that's the case, but I haven't seen that yet. So I want to make it clear that that is part of the reason, in fact, that I didn't want to just sign my name to a Christians for Kamala piece, because I wanted to wait and see where she ended up on a few of these issues. And on a few of them, I'm still waiting to see.
I mean, also you publish in your Substack, you talked about the DNC missed opportunity to platform Palestinians, a Palestinian Christian, Palestinian American who also was vetted by the DNC. And you also, this is kind of just so ironic that even the parents of the Israeli American hostage did way more to humanize Palestinians in Gaza than any of the Democratic officials. And that was a missed opportunity, right? You saw in the DNC, like, it's still failing to understand the Palestinian position.
Just shocking that they could not. And I was grateful, to these poor parents who have since lost their son, who has since died.
Oh, that's
but I was
right.
grateful for them that
they
took that opportunity while on stage at the DNC to not only advocate for the return of their son, which is now not going to happen. He was buried over there.
He was one of the 6 hostages.
One of the 6 hostages. That's correct.
Oh,
yeah. So just a horrible situation, obviously, and my heart breaks for them. But I am so grateful that they, even in the midst of all of that, nobody should have to. We ask so much of these parents, but they also took the time to humanize what is happening to the Palestinian people, to the genocide in Gaza. And they deserve they deserve, obviously, our mourning. We need to mourn with those who mourn, and we need to mourn with them. We also need to be grateful for them for doing something that so far the Democratic Party has not done a good job of, which is advocating for the least of these, for the people who cannot advocate for themselves in Gaza, even as we send over missiles and weapons and training to incinerate their homes and their families.
Friends, if you're enjoying this episode and want to support Across the Divide, consider supporting the work we're doing here through our Patreon page at patreon.com/acrossthedivide. By becoming a monthly supporter, you'll gain access to unpublished content and other exclusive benefits. Again, the link is patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Thank you, and back to the episode.
Here's the quote from your article. Kamala Harris is failing her first big test. You say, but as long as the DNC refuses to give the same space to Palestinian victims of this horrible war, the message they send is that there is a hierarchy of human worth in the Democratic Party, and Palestinian lives are simply too low on the list to be worth mentioning. And to be fair, Tyler, this has been the case for 76 years. This is not just since October 7th. There's a shift that is happening in the Democratic Party. And I would like to, because also yesterday was a debate between Harris and Trump. And I want to ask you about that if you listen to it. But 76 years of Christian and American just amnesia and ignorance about what's happening. And I know so many wonderful people now who are strong allies for Palestine. And they were like, we started reading about Palestine after October 7th. And it's like, and for me, it's like, I love you and I'm so grateful for your advocacy right now, but how come?
Yeah, what took so long?
What took you so long? But I mean, everyone has the reasons, and I don't want to judge anyone here. But I think I know the answer to that question is because Palestinian lives never mattered for the American people or for the American government. Maybe for some Americans, but for the American government, there's a very strong position that is anti-Palestinian, not just pro-Israel. You can be pro-Israel, but if you're not also being pro-Palestinian at the same time, obviously you're anti-Palestinian because your support is only going to one side at the expense of the other. And I think that just says volume, I think, about American foreign policy and also historic American attitudes towards different minorities, whether the natives or who were the majority, blacks and others. Their just lives never mattered. And that's, for me, this is, I think, important. Because I'm more critical than you of the DNC, is because that thing also shows that there's a continued dehumanization of Palestinians. And I think for me, I see a thread that goes all the way to the genocide of Native Americans through slavery all the way to today. I think it's just part of the American culture that you always had those people that you just don't pay attention to. Donald and Kamala had a debate last night. We're recording on September 11th, actually today. Oh, this is also a rough anniversary as well, 9/11.
It is September 11th,
So Kamala said some nice things. She says, that I'm also heartbroken by what's happening in Gaza, and I want to guarantee the dignity of the Palestinians, something to that effect. And I think she used the party line about the two-state solution, the same stuff that Biden used to say as well. Yeah. Anyway, what are your takes about that? I think I saw your Twitter. Your Twitter was a bit active last night.
Well, I actually did not watch it until I was not there live, but I caught up on it a little bit this morning. Right. So I did catch up. So I'm current with it now. Yeah, I think, like you said, this has been the line that we've heard from Democrats for pretty much I think in some ways I feel like and I don't have any empirical evidence to back this up, but I feel like the Overton window on these things has shifted rightward. It does seem like I've got a lot of problems with former President Ronald Reagan, but he was moved by what was happening in Gaza, by the attack on Palestinian people in a way we just have not seen from any administration in my lifetime, certainly not from the Democrats. That has been disappointing because I feel like we've lost a lot of ground. And the conversation, as often happens on this issue, on the issue of immigration in the U.S. as well, just seems to keep lurching rightward so that the moderate position or even the left-leaning position feels more and more conservative than it would have 10, 20 years ago. So I'm glad that Harris says that she's heartbroken about what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. I prefer that to her not saying that, obviously. But as always, the real test is, well, what are you going to do about it? This is a fixable thing for you. There's a lot of things about what's happening in the Middle East that are complicated. This isn't one of them. And if you are heartbroken about it, all you have to do is stop sending weapons over. That is an easy, straightforward way.
You just quoted Ilhan Omar by saying that,
unintentionally. But
no, but
I
you do
want to
quote
say
her.
Ilhan Omar. She deserves every credit in the world. I've been extremely impressed with her. She's an extremely brave woman, and I'm very grateful for her leadership on this issue.
Yeah, no, I remember this because I just read that article about you saying that about Ilhan Omar being the courageous woman. And she's like, hey, you know what? If you actually care about the Palestinians, if you want to have a ceasefire, you can just stop sending the bombs. And it's like, yeah, it makes sense. Of course, they wouldn't do it because it's an election year and all that stuff, and they need to support Israel. So, I mean, you're showing your cards, obviously. If you're saying that Ilhan Omar is very courageous and you're critical of the Democratic Party, then it's not like you were a moderate, Republican. You moved all the way to the extreme left there, Ty.
I like Omar. I've got issues with, like I said, and I wrote this in the piece. I don't think my politics map easily onto other party. I don't think most people's do, if we're being honest with ourselves, really. But if I fit anywhere, it's kind of on the, politically at least, on the far, like kind of outside left side of what we have to call the Democrats, where you find people like Omar, where I think AOC still kind of is occasionally now and then. Rashida Tlaib, who I find to be quite impressive. People like that. And when I see some of their advocacy on this issue and other issues, that does give me hope.
Okay, so you just mentioned names of people in the squad. Okay, good to know.
I know.
Okay, but the thing is, Tyler,
like I said, I'm not a fan of any politicians. I don't do fandom for politicians, but I like when they say things. I tend to I agree with them more often than I don't.
But the thing is, Tyler, you are not this is why I'm kind of impressed by you. Like, you're not saying, oh, I'm a lefty, I'm going to go with the squad. You're saying, my theology informs my politics. I think I don't want to speak for you here, but and you say this clearly, like, I would like to see every American earn a living wage and have access to healthcare. I want well-funded public schools. I want strong unions. I want LGBTQ kids to live without fear, and like, so and like, for me, it's like, this is what a Christian would want, right? You want what's good for the least of these. You want people to have decent jobs and to live in security and safety and have healthcare as a right for them that is not denied of them because of their poverty. And it's like, you're being faithful to, I think, to following Jesus. I think it's very clear to me from the scriptures where Christ would stand when it comes to the dynamics of socioeconomics and politics and power. He would be aligned with people who cannot afford healthcare and those who do not have a living wage, and not with those who are powerful, not with the billionaires. But then, it's like, this is what my faith is telling me to stand when it comes to these social political issues. But now, I guess that's where the progressive left is. So I guess I'm way, but like, you didn't choose to be a progressive, a progressive
I kind of
Democrat.
found myself there. Yeah. And but I'm also, to be clear, I'm also very inspired and encouraged when I find other Christians like myself who have found themselves in similar spaces. And there is not a lot of us or anything like that. But the more you find, the more affirming it is that, like, oh, hey, maybe this water is okay if I'm not the first one there. Maybe I'm not, somebody on Twitter with a Roman statue for an avatar can say I'm not a Christian anymore because I vote for this person or support this political issue or whatever, and that doesn't hurt my feelings anymore. But finding other Christians who are in this space, who've been working on this space, who have been activists in this space, people who very rarely come from my tradition. More often they're people from the Black church, obviously, which has a long and really beautiful history of liberation here in the U.S. Immigrants from other countries, people who have come over here who are Palestinian, who are Haitian, which is obviously over the past 48 hours become extremely been terrifying to see the demonization of the Haitian people, who are an incredible, a remarkable story. The history of Haiti is amazing and should be inspiring to any Christian,
Right.
any
Yeah.
person, really. But that just isn't really. So when I see the courage and the charity and the work that these people have accomplished and that have accomplished in this space, which we'll call leftism for lack of a better term, that gives me a lot of comfort and peace that, I can't, these people can't tell me wrong who are over here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. To know what Haitian people have went through over the last few years, of just natural devastations and disasters, and just impoverished and poor, and coming to this country, to the US, to seek a better life. And then they've been attacked for cultural issues, for like eating cats. But that's the thing. You see, this is the thing this is me as an outsider being in the US. Who's the next savage? Who's the next person that we're going to make into a monster? And so it was just a Palestinian yesterday, and now it's the Haitian person. But it doesn't stop. It's insane to me, and it baffles me that this is such a public thing that a nominee for office, for presidency, would say, and his VP would say the same thing. Like, how is this acceptable in the American political discourse? Like, how is this okay? It just baffles me.
I've lived here my whole life, and I can't answer that question for you. I don't know. And this is from the community that I grew up in, as much as anyone. JD Vance, he's an adult convert to Catholicism. He was raised kind of like mainstream Christian, so he's been in and around my circles. I can't explain it. I don't know what's going on with this guy.
Speaking of being Catholic, we had. I don't know when this episode is going to come out, but I just had interviews with wonderful Catholic women who written an article about Catholic social teaching and how the Catholic Church's teachings on the preferential option for the poor, the dignity of all humans, helps them. These teachings help them to think about Palestine. I'm like, yeah, JD Vance, okay, cool. You were evangelical, now you're Catholic. I guess that, either way, you couldn't humanize people, and whether it's the Palestinians, whether it's Haitians.
He kind of took the worst of both cultures, and wherever to whichever religion he became a part of, and he's a. I mean, I know this is an overused word for these guys, but he's a weird one, and I do think with him, you also see some of that big tech money. Some of those strange ideas floating around with guys like Peter Thiel. And I think that has a lot more influence on his politics and his ideology than his religion does.
Yeah, no, totally. I don't think their faith matters here. JD Vance's, it's not like Trump has much of that anyway. So yeah, I guess if we're critical of the DNC or of Harris and Biden, doesn't mean that we support Trump, right? Like, how do you break that binary that Christians usually and Americans have? And I have these conversations a lot with people who are just shocked that I would be so critical of Trump, that they assume it has to be one, either that. Like, if I'm so critical of Trump, therefore I'm a outrageous liberal, like a communist.
Sure.
Or if I'm critical of the Democratic Party, therefore I'm a Republican. There's just like this very simple binary way of thinking. Yeah. So how do you break that mold? How do you break that binary way of thinking, at least for yourself?
I think it's good to be, in my experience, when I think it does kind of break people's brains when you are critical of a party that they associate you with. If you say something, if you go on the internet, or you're at your family dinner table, or you're at church, or wherever you find yourself, and you say something mean about Donald Trump in public, and somebody says, well, the Democrats do the same thing, or Harris, right, what about Harris did this? They say that. And then what you should say, if that's true, if they're accurate, just say, well, yeah, and it sucks when she does it too, or I don't like that either. And that immediately takes so much wind out of the debate that other person thought they were going to have with you, because they thought this was going to be one of those standards, right, left, CNN, talking heads just shouting at each other. But now they find out that you've got an actual moral code that rises above the partisan line of Republican and Democrat that is not beholden to either. And what that does, in my experience, is it humanizes the conversation. It allows you to have an actual discussion with this person, because now we're just talking about my person is better than your person. You're talking about real ethics that matter to you and the causes. And I think it can obviously kind of break people's brains at first to start thinking that way. But I also think it's actually a bridge to a much better, healthier way of relating to people, let alone relating to the world around you, because the world doesn't, unfortunately, the world does not abide by your Republican Democrat binaries. That's just not how things go. So I know that it can seem complicated, and breaking through it does take refiguring some of your internal hardwiring that's been set by years and years and years of cable news and late night talk shows and what happens on Twitter or anywhere else. But once you get there, I find it to be so freeing, actually, and so humanizing, and the world becomes far more three-dimensional in a way that it hasn't been for Americans for a long time. I get I wrote about this a little bit, I think, in that article for Related News Service, the Why I'm Not a Christian for Kamala. I get a little impatient with people. You hear this a lot in Christian circles. Well, I don't follow the donkey or the elephant. I follow the lamb. Or I'm not Republican. They say that. And then if you peel back the layers just an inch, you're like, well, but you do vote Republican all the time. Like, I know what you mean, but you're just a Republican. You can just say that. I think that there is this sort of, among a certain group of Christians who I find myself around quite a bit, and this would include, I won't name names, you know who these people are. There's this sort of obsession with centrism and moderation that is just centrism and moderation for its own sake. It's this idea that there's something inherently virtuistic about being in the middle of issues, and then that is just the obviously mature thing, not because you have any ethical or moral reasoning to be there, but just because you get to kind of hold your head high over everybody else who is in their camps, and you're right between them in the middle. If that's where your politics and your moral code takes you, I'm not going to argue with you on that, but it seems to me like for the most part, it's just people who are trying to twist the dial on their own politics to find out what the exact middle is, so that they can have as few fights as possible with people. And I do not find that to be a helpful political way of thinking about politics. What I'd rather have is people figure out, what are your morals? What do you feel like God is calling you to? What do you think the way of Jesus is in the world? How do we advocate for the least of these? Jesus said he's manifested in the poor. Where are the poor? What would help the poor? What would help Jesus be? This is all basic Sermon on the Mount stuff. But I'd rather people start there. And I think what you'd find, if you started there, is that moderation is not really much of an option for Christians. The way of Jesus is very extreme in a lot of different ways. Not necessarily, extremism has sort of an ugly term. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean there's some pretty radical stuff in the New Testament that people are being called to. And I'm not saying that I've achieved it perfectly or anything like that. Obviously, I have a long ways to go in my own sanctification. God's getting me closer every day. But I do think that we need to be very, very careful about just trying to find a position that gets us out of the fray. I think that we should be in the fray in a way more serious way than most of our friends and neighbors. And I think that would be very, very, I think if we want to see real change, if we really want to break through that binary, if we want to see this nation become something better than what it is right now, if you're really truly sick of this, as everybody says they are, then the best way to do that is to have your politics defined by the Bible and not the other way around.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah, that's it. That's beautiful. Yeah, thanks for that. Here's a quote I think that kind of speaks to what you just said. Also, I have all these quotes ready for you. I'm quoting you to yourself, but it's also it's for the audience, obviously. But I really encourage everyone to read the article here. But he says, you say here, I do not think either Trump or Harris is going to bring the kingdom proclaimed in the Sermon on the Mount to reality. I do think Harris is likely to get us marginally closer, but not if all of us just put the entirety of our weight behind her, no questions asked. Now is not the time to pledge blind allegiance. Now is the time to start making some demands. But that's the thing, like your constitution is not a certain platform of the party. Your constitution is a Sermon on the Mount, and based on that, you make your political decisions. And you're saying, I have no illusions about the problems with Harris and with the DNC, with the Democratic Party. You're actually very critical of them, but you're saying, when it comes to how I want to see the Sermon of the Mount being applied today, I can see it clearly. I can see at least the Democratic Party is moving towards that more than the Republican Party, at least.
Yeah, or that we can move them. We the voters can move them towards that. Hopefully, I hope so.
So you're saying that the Republican Party is hopeless when it comes to these issues, especially a lot of issues, but at least when it comes to Palestine. And that's the thing is like, people have been saying, oh, well, at least the Democratic Party would have you at the DNC, Republicans would never even welcome you there. So there's this thing like Republicans are hopeless. There's no, but it's true, right? There's no, I can't think of any possible hopeful kind of way in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I don't see a way out for them, and I think that has probably also been true for a lot longer than a lot of people want to admit. I think there's this idea that Donald Trump represented a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde transformation from the GOP to something else. And I'm not convinced it was quite in terms stylistically, of course, in terms of just presentation and aesthetic, and there's a pretty serious shift. But in terms of actual policy, I don't know that he's that big of a break from the politics of George W. Bush, who, say what you will about the guy, but caused far more damage to the global, to just in terms of human cost, than Donald Trump probably has the wherewithal to even figure out how to do if he wanted to. Same thing with people like Ronald Reagan, and honestly, probably same thing with people like Bill Clinton. So I think that the decline, the hopelessness that you talk about with the GOP has probably been there for longer than even I wanted to admit. And unfortunately, this was finally made manifest by Donald Trump with all those chickens coming home to roost.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of George Bush, and then Kamala Harris yesterday at the debate, she's like, Dick Cheney himself now is going to vote for me. And I'm like, do you know
don't
Dick
get me started.
Do you think that's a good thing for you? Like, does it help you? How tone deaf?
Yeah. Batman couldn't beat that information out of me. I'm sorry.
Tyler, we ran out of time. This has been really fun. I really appreciate the way that you're grounding your politics in the ethics of the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount. I think that's huge. Even if listeners would disagree with how you're voting and they're going to vote for someone else or vote third party, actually, I would have loved to ask about voting third party. Actually, I'm not going to finish the episode. Let's talk about third party because you're choosing. Sorry, you're in Tennessee. You're in the South.
That's right.
It's a red state. So it doesn't really matter how you vote, third party or Democrat.
Unfortunately, right? That's right. That's very true. I do it, but it's symbolic.
No, but it's a principled vote. I don't think it's a last vote. But why wouldn't you vote for someone like Jill Stein, who, for example, came out very strongly pro-Palestine and anti-genocide? Why is it Kamala?
For Jill Stein specifically, I find I find her thing a little bit cynical. I would have quite a bit more respect for Stein and what she says if she spent the 3.5 years in between presidential elections actually trying to build a movement. And I think that there's a lot of really excellent change that can be done at the local level, that Jill Stein has the platform and the connections and the infrastructure to enact. And I wish she would, instead of this like Hail Mary pass every 4 years maybe become president. But in general, third party, I would love to see a third party candidate. I think we need to break the two-party system in the U.S. I think our future as a country probably depends on it to a certain extent. I think, in my opinion, and I know this is controversial, I think the worst time to try to do that is in November at the ballot box. I think the best time to do that is the other 355 days of the year, when you can actually start building local movements in your community and work towards change that get out of, I think it's comparatively much easier to try to think beyond the Republican Democrat binary in your neighborhood, in your city, maybe even sometimes in your state, and then use that movement to grow into something that is big and that is powerful when it comes time to vote for a presidential election. I don't think that until that happens, there's really a chance for a third party to make their. Now, I think if you choose to vote third party, in a primary or something like that, I think that's useful. I mean, it can be valuable. I think it's good to sometimes scare your party of choice a little bit by withholding your vote, just to remind them that you're not, that you're not just an automatic down ballot vote no matter what. But there's a lot of people who are going to suffer a lot if Donald Trump becomes president again. And it's not clear to me how a third party vote helps them. Now, I do not think that not voting for Kamala equals a vote for Donald Trump. I don't believe that. I don't like when people say that. I think that's fear mongering, and I think that is an insult to the consciences of people who have very, very good and I think ethical, moral reasons to vote third party. What I'd like to see, and what the uncommitted movement has done very well, is start building a movement in the off years and make that something that has power and leverage come November. So I have sort of nuanced thoughts about that. I will probably, like I said, my vote for Kamala right now. There's a lot that I want to see from her. And like I said, I have been disappointed on some of the things that she's talked about. I've been encouraged by others, but in terms of the issue that I led with, like I said in that piece, is what's happening in Gaza. And that has been, I really thought it was going to be better than this. I just really did. So that's where I'm at on a third party vote.
Right. Yeah. There was some kind of hope about some kind of significant third party influence on the elections with RFK and then Cornel West.
Yeah, for sure.
And Jill Stein, but then all of that kind of fizzled away. RFK was looped into with it's kind of kissed the hand of Trump, and then Cornel West couldn't get off the ground, and Jill Stein still has, I think, a very insignificant numbers right now. No, but that's an interesting take, Tyler. I appreciate that. Yeah. To finish then, is Gaza like a single issue for you, or like a close to one this elections?
That's a good question. I've thought about that myself. I don't know that I'm quite there. It's close. I think it's the human toll has been so enormous that it seems almost morally offensive to not consider that to be, if not a single issue, then one of a pretty small handful of issues. And I think that is becoming true for more and more people. And it seems like that is becoming a bigger and bigger issue as these headlines aren't going away. I think the Democrats kind of want it to. I think they're hoping that they can just continue offering the usual DNC platitudes and that people will just shut up about it. I don't think that's going to happen because the death toll just keeps climbing. And the more it climbs, the closer this becomes to a single issue. And I think that we should, even if it's not your single issue, like there are obviously other things that are important that are happening, including, I think the immigration issue is very, very important right now here in the U.S. It's extremely significant. Women's healthcare is obviously also another extremely significant issue. And I understand people voting as if their lives depended on that, because in many cases it does. But I think we should act, those of us who care about this, we should act as if it's a single issue. And we should be using our voices, our activism, our boots on the ground in our local communities to make the Harris campaign think this is a single issue that could cost them very, very seriously in November. And I don't see any harm in acting like that for the next 2 months that we have ahead of us here until voting day.
And that's kind of the hope I think I have with the uncommitted movement, that, and to your point, yeah, if you keep growing and moving and mobilizing, and I think the Arab Muslim Palestine vote would coalesce into a voting bloc, I think would be huge moving forward for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we need to wrap it up here. This is longer than I wanted it to be, but so much goodness in this conversation. Stick around, Tyler. I want to talk with you about Christianity today. But yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. Really, really, really helpful, thoughtful ways to help us, I think about the elections coming up. So thank you, Tyler.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.